reports of encounters with aliens on deserted highways. It was supposed to be a quiet drive home. The highway was empty, the night calm. Then she saw it, a figure, unnaturally thin, standing motionless in the middle of the road. Its eyes glowed an impossible green, locking onto hers as if it already knew her name. The car stalled. Her phone died. And in that moment, she realized she wasn't alone. The headlights struggled against the oppressive darkness of Highway 49, their weak beams barely slicing through the void that surrounded Emma's car. She gripped the steering wheel tighter, her fingers trembling slightly with every bump in the road. There was no radio signal out here, no familiar voices to fill the void, only the faint hum of the engine and the repetitive crunch of tires against the cracked asphalt. The silence pressed down on her like a physical weight. It wasn't peaceful, it was suffocating, as if the night itself were watching, waiting. Emma's eyes flicked to the dashboard clock. 12:43 a.m. How had it gotten so late? It felt like hours had passed, but she had only driven a few miles since her last turn. She glanced at her phone on the passenger seat. No service. Of course. The road stretched ahead endlessly, a ribbon of black that seemed to unravel into oblivion. Every so often, her peripheral vision caught fleeting shapes at the edge of the headlights. Trees, she thought, or maybe road signs. But the shapes felt wrong, jagged and misshapen, twisting into unnatural angles that didn't make sense. She shook her head, convincing herself it was just her exhaustion playing tricks. She was 3 hours into a 6-hour drive, and the monotony of the empty road was already eating away at her focus. She adjusted her rearview mirror absent-mindedly, catching a glimpse of her own pale face reflected in the dim light. But when she looked closer, her stomach twisted. For a split second, it looked like someone or something was sitting in the back seat, staring back at her with hollow eyes. She slammed the brakes instinctively, her body jerking forward as the car screeched to a halt. Heart racing, she whipped her head around to look behind her. The back seat was empty. Nothing there but the rumpled jacket she'd tossed in earlier. She exhaled sharply, trying to laugh at her own paranoia. "You're losing it, Emma," she muttered to herself, her voice sounding too loud in the oppressive silence. She adjusted her mirror again, this time making sure nothing was out of place. Just the empty back seat, just her overactive imagination. Then she saw it. Far ahead, barely visible through the thick darkness, a faint light pulsed on the horizon. Emma squinted, leaning forward in her seat. It wasn't like any light she'd seen before. It didn't glow steadily like a street light or flicker like the beams of another car. This light moved erratically, like it was alive. It pulsed rhythmically, but the pattern was strange, unpredictable. It reminded her of the heartbeat of a small, frantic animal. She hesitated, debating whether to keep driving. But curiosity tugged at her, an almost magnetic pull. Maybe it was a stalled car. Maybe someone needed help. Or maybe she just needed to see it. Her foot pressed down on the gas pedal almost involuntarily, and the car lurched forward. The further she drove, the brighter the light became. But something about it felt wrong. The air inside the car grew heavier, tinged with a faint metallic scent that made her nose crinkle. It smelled like burnt wires, sharp and acrid. Her chest tightened, and she reached to roll down the window, but the button didn't respond. "What the hell?" she muttered, pressing it harder. Still nothing. The buttons on the radio were dead too. She glanced at her phone again. The screen was black, though she had charged it fully before leaving. Panic began to creep into her thoughts, a cold, slithering sensation that coiled around her brain. The light ahead seemed closer now, almost too close. It wasn't just a distant glow anymore. It was a presence, something tangible, something she could feel pressing against her skin. She turned on her high beams, but they barely seemed to make a difference. The darkness around her was too thick, too alive, swallowing the light before it could stretch more than a few feet ahead. As she drove closer, her hands began to sweat, slipping slightly on the steering wheel. The metallic smell in the air grew stronger, mixed now with something earthier, like damp soil after a heavy rain. But the scent was wrong, too sharp, too bitter. It made her stomach churn, and she had to swallow hard to keep the bile from rising in her throat. She tried to tell herself it was all in her head. Exhaustion could play tricks on you, especially on a lonely road like this. She gripped the wheel tighter and forced herself to keep going. The light shifted again, and for a moment Emma swore it looked like it was watching her. She blinked, trying to focus on the road, but the sensation wouldn't go away. Her skin crawled, as though 1,000 invisible eyes were crawling over her body, studying her every move. She turned her head quickly, looking out the side window, but there was nothing. Just the endless stretch of empty road and the vague outlines of the trees, their branches twisting unnaturally under the dim light of the moon. Then the hum started. At first it was faint, barely audible over the sound of the tires on the asphalt. But it grew louder, deeper, reverberating through the car like a low vibration. It wasn't a mechanical sound. It was organic, guttural, like the growl of some enormous beast. It wasn't coming from outside. It was coming from inside her head. She slammed her foot on the brakes again, the car screeching to a halt. The light ahead didn't stop moving. It pulsed faster now, like it was agitated, as if it had noticed her hesitation. Emma's breath came in short, shallow gasps, her chest heaving as the hum intensified. She pressed her hands against her ears, but it didn't help. The sound wasn't something she could block out. It was inside her, vibrating through her skull, scraping against her thoughts. Her vision blurred, and for a moment, the light on the horizon split into 2, then 3, then dozens, each one pulsing in a different rhythm, like a swarm of fireflies circling prey. She tried to put the car in reverse, but the gear shift wouldn't budge. The steering wheel locked in place, unresponsive no matter how hard she tugged. The lights seemed to move closer, faster, their pulsing growing erratic, almost angry. And that's when she realized this wasn't just a light, it was alive. As the car crept closer to the source of the strange, flickering light, Emma's unease evolved into a visceral, clawing dread. Her breaths came in shallow gasps as the light swayed hypnotically, drawing her forward like a moth to a flame. There was a primal wrongness to its motion, a rhythm that didn't follow the rules of nature or physics. It was neither consistent nor random, but something in between, an unsteady pendulum swing that seemed calculated, deliberate. Emma tried to focus on the road, but her eyes were involuntarily drawn to the light ahead. The way it danced erratically, yet somehow felt alive, pulsating like a wound bleeding energy into the night. The air inside the car thickened, pressing against her chest as though she was submerged under miles of water. Each breath carried the metallic tang of something unnatural, tinged with an acrid sharpness that reminded her of scorched circuits and ozone after a lightning strike. Her lungs burned with every inhale, and she found herself coughing as if the air itself were rejecting her presence. Emma reached for the window controls again, her hands fumbling with the unresponsive buttons. She hit them harder, cursing under her breath, but the mechanisms refused to obey. The windows stayed shut, locking her in with the oppressive atmosphere. The dashboard lights flickered. First, the speedometer needle began to twitch erratically. Then the fuel gauge plummeted to empty, despite having filled the tank earlier that evening. The radio, though already silent, emitted a faint static hum that grew louder and louder, like white noise amplified to a deafening pitch. Emma slapped the controls, desperate to silence the noise, but the buttons were as dead as her phone. It wasn't just the car failing. It was as though something outside was asserting control, draining the life from everything mechanical. Her heartbeat pounded in her ears, each thud a countdown to something she couldn't yet comprehend. Emma glanced into the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the same strange figure she thought she'd glimpsed earlier. The back seat was empty, but the mirror itself seemed wrong. The reflection wasn't quite aligned with reality. The road behind her appeared warped, like heat waves shimmering off blacktop on a summer day. Except this was the dead of night. The shadows of the trees on either side of the highway stretched and contorted unnaturally, their jagged shapes writhing like living things. Emma turned her head to look directly at the road behind her, but when she did, the shadows looked perfectly still, motionless. She whipped her gaze back to the mirror, and there it was again, movement where there should have been none. Her skin prickled as the sensation of being watched grew stronger. It was subtle at first, a vague feeling she couldn't quite place, but it quickly intensified. It felt as though 1,000 invisible eyes were burrowing into her, dissecting her every movement. She couldn't shake the thought that something unseen was sharing the car with her, occupying the spaces she couldn't directly observe. The thought made her stomach churn. Her hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly that her nails dug into the leather, leaving shallow, crescent-shaped indents. The light ahead flared suddenly, blinding her momentarily. Emma squinted, instinctively raising her hand to shield her eyes. When the brightness receded, she realized that the light had moved. It was no longer on the horizon. It was closer now, too close. She couldn't make out a source or shape, but it hovered just beyond the reach of her high beams, pulsing with a rhythm that resonated deep within her chest. It wasn't just light anymore. It carried a sound, low and guttural, like the distorted growl of an animal too large to exist. The sound wasn't coming from outside the car. It was inside, vibrating through the frame, seeping into her bones. Emma clutched her ears, trying to block it out. But it only grew louder, a relentless drone that seemed to burrow into her skull. Her thoughts became sluggish, disjointed, as if the noise were scrambling her mind. She bit down hard on her lip, the sharp pain grounding her just enough to regain focus. "Get a grip, Emma," she whispered to herself, her voice trembling. But even saying the words out loud felt hollow, as though the car itself was absorbing her voice. The metallic taste in the air intensified, now mixed with something earthier and far more unpleasant. It smelled like decay, like wet soil clinging to something rotting just beneath the surface. Emma gagged, covering her mouth with one hand while struggling to keep the car steady with the other. Her eyes darted to the sides of the road, hoping for some sign of normalcy. A house, a gas station, even another car. But there was nothing. The world outside was a void, endless and consuming, as if the highway had been swallowed whole by the night. And then she saw them. At first, Emma thought they were trees. Dark shapes lined the edges of the road, tall and unmoving. But as the car crawled forward, she realized they were wrong. Too symmetrical, too perfectly spaced to be natural. They stood in rigid formation, their silhouettes unnervingly human, yet unmistakably alien. Their limbs were unnaturally long, their heads tilted at sharp angles as though observing her with an intelligence that felt ancient and predatory. Emma's stomach clenched as her headlights passed over them, but the beams didn't illuminate any details. The figures remained cloaked in shadow, their outlines sharp yet intangible, like smudges on reality itself. The hum inside her head grew more erratic, pulsing in sync with the light. Emma's hands shook violently on the steering wheel, and for a brief moment she considered flooring the gas and driving straight through whatever was ahead. But something stopped her, an instinct, primal and overpowering, that told her speeding past the figures would only provoke them. She kept her pace slow, crawling forward inch by inch, her every nerve screaming at her to turn around and flee. The figures moved. It wasn't a natural movement. They didn't walk or shift like living beings. Instead, they glided closer, their feet, or whatever passed for feet, never touching the ground. Emma's breathing hitched as they closed the distance. Their eyeless faces locked onto her with an intensity that made her chest ache. She wanted to scream, but the sound caught in her throat, her vocal cords frozen with fear. Then, one of them tilted its head further, almost completely sideways, and raised a hand. It was long and skeletal, with too many joints bending at angles that made Emma's stomach churn. The hand stretched toward the car, fingers twitching as though testing the air. The light flared again, blinding her, and when it dimmed, the figures were gone. Or so she thought. Emma didn't dare look in the mirror again. deep down, she knew if she did, she wouldn't be alone. The car came to a violent, jarring stop, as if it had struck an invisible wall. Emma's body lurched forward, her seatbelt digging painfully into her chest as her forehead nearly hit the steering wheel. Gasping for air, she gripped the sides of her seat, her pulse roaring in her ears. The sudden silence that followed was suffocating, deafening even. The car's engine sputtered weakly, trying to roar back to life, but it gave out with a final, pitiful cough, leaving her stranded in an abyss of darkness. She sat frozen, staring out at the windshield, where the pulsing light still hovered in the distance, almost mocking her. Her fingers trembled as she reached for the ignition, twisting the key over and over. The engine didn't even bother to turn. It was dead, just like her phone, just like the dashboard lights. Every source of modern life and comfort seemed to have abandoned her. "Come on!" she hissed through gritted teeth, slamming her palm against the steering wheel. The echo of the impact felt unnaturally loud, bouncing back at her like a distorted whisper. For the first time, Emma allowed herself to truly feel the weight of her isolation. There was no one coming to save her, no lifeline, just her, the night, and them. The air inside the car felt alive now, thick and restless, pressing against her skin in waves. It felt as though she was breathing in something sentient, as if invisible hands were wrapping around her throat. Each inhale was a struggle, the air metallic and rancid, like it had been stolen from a place where no human should ever venture. Emma's stomach churned, her throat tightening as bile threatened to rise. She tried to roll the window down again, but the controls remained lifeless. The doors wouldn't budge either. She was trapped, sealed inside a steel coffin, with nothing but the suffocating stillness and the oppressive light outside. Her trembling hand moved to the phone on the passenger seat. She picked it up, desperate for any semblance of contact, any link to the world she had been so carelessly pulled away from. The screen was still black, unresponsive. But as her thumb hovered over the power button, something unexpected happened. A faint glow emanated from the screen, flickering like a dying ember. Relief flooded her for a brief moment. Maybe she could call for help after all. But as the screen came to life, her relief turned to cold, paralyzing terror. The screen wasn't displaying her home screen or any familiar app. Instead, it showed a live feed of the car's interior, as if a hidden camera were pointed directly at her. The image was grainy and distorted, the colors muted, but there was no mistaking what she saw. It was her, sitting in the driver's seat, her wide, frightened eyes staring directly into the camera. She quickly turned her head, scanning the car's interior for any sign of a lens or device, but there was nothing. Just her reflection in the rearview mirror and the oppressive darkness pressing against the windows. When she looked back at the screen, her stomach dropped. The live feed was no longer static. Something was moving in the frame. At first it was subtle, a faint shift in the shadows behind her. But then it became unmistakable. A figure was emerging in the back seat, its form stretching unnaturally, as if the shadows themselves were giving birth to it. Emma's throat tightened as the figure leaned forward in the feed, its face partially illuminated by the faint glow of her phone. It didn't have features, not exactly. Its face was smooth, devoid of eyes, a nose or a mouth. Yet she could feel its gaze piercing her, dissecting her with an intensity that made her skin crawl. Her grip on the phone faltered, and it fell into her lap. Emma whipped around to face the back seat, her breath hitching in her throat. But it was empty. Nothing there. Just the crumpled jacket she had thrown there earlier. She stared at it, waiting for it to shift, to morph into something it wasn't supposed to be. But it remained still, lifeless. Her mind raced, trying to make sense of what she had just seen. Was it a hallucination? Some cruel trick of her imagination? A faint knock on the windshield snapped her out of her spiraling thoughts. It was soft, almost gentle, like a child tapping to get someone's attention. Emma froze, her heart pounding in her chest like a trapped animal. Slowly, she turned her head toward the sound. Her eyes met the windshield, but there was nothing there. just the pulsing light in the distance, glowing steadily, almost serenely. The knock came again, louder this time, from the driver's side window. Emma's breath caught as she turned to face the window. Her reflection stared back at her, pale and wide-eyed. But then the reflection did something she hadn't. It smiled. Not a normal smile, but a grotesque, exaggerated grin that stretched far too wide, revealing teeth that were jagged and unnervingly white. Emma recoiled, pressing herself against the driver's seat as the smile grew wider, almost splitting her reflection's face in half. And then the knocking became frantic. It wasn't just on the driver's side anymore, it was coming from all around her. The windshield, the passenger window, the back seat, even the roof. The sound was relentless, an overwhelming cacophony that filled the car, reverberating in her skull. Each knock was sharp and precise, as if whatever was outside was toying with her, testing her resolve. Emma screamed, covering her ears in a futile attempt to block out the noise. But it wasn't just the knocking anymore. Beneath it, she could hear something else, a low, guttural whisper that seemed to seep into her thoughts. It wasn't a language she recognized, but the meaning was clear. "Come out." Her vision blurred as tears streamed down her face, her body trembling uncontrollably. The phone in her lap buzzed violently, the screen flickering to life again. Against her better judgment, she picked it up, her hands shaking so badly that she almost dropped it. This time, the screen displayed a single message in jagged, glitching text. "Open the door." Emma shook her head violently, clutching the phone to her chest as if holding it close would protect her. The knocking intensified, each hit reverberating through the car like thunder. The roof began to dent inward, shallow at first, then deeper, as though something heavy were crawling across it. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, filling her head with chaotic, overlapping voices. She screamed again, her voice raw and desperate, and slammed her fist against the horn. The blaring sound shattered the oppressive silence, and for a moment, everything stopped. The knocking ceased. The whispers faded, even the pulsing light outside seemed to dim, retreating slightly into the distance. Emma sat frozen, her chest heaving as she struggled to catch her breath. But the silence didn't last. A deep, resonating creak echoed from the passenger side door, so loud and deliberate that it made Emma's entire body seize with terror. Slowly, against her will, her eyes were drawn to the door handle. It was turning. The knock on the driver's side window had been soft at first, so faint that Emma thought she might have imagined it. But now, as the sound began again, louder and more insistent, the reality of it pressed against her like a crushing weight. The noise seemed to come from everywhere at once, sharp, rhythmic, and deliberate. It was not the frantic banging of someone desperate for help, but something far worse, calculated, patient, and entirely alien in its intent. Her pulse thudded violently in her ears as she turned her head slowly, her every nerve screaming against the movement. The window was a sheet of darkness, reflecting only the dim, pulsating glow from the distant light ahead. For a moment, she thought she saw her own pale face staring back at her, her wide eyes filled with terror. But then it shifted. The reflection twisted, contorting into something else entirely. The face in the glass wasn't hers anymore. It was stretched, grotesque, the mouth pulled into an inhuman grin that seemed to split the entire face apart. The eyes were no longer wide with fear, but impossibly black, hollow voids that swallowed the faint light around them. Emma recoiled, her breath catching in her throat. She slammed her eyes shut, hoping the image would dissolve, but the knocking only grew louder. Her shaking hand hovered over the lock on the car door, her mind waging a war against itself. Every instinct screamed for her to keep the doors locked, to stay inside. But another voice, a quieter, darker whisper buried deep in her thoughts, urged her to open it. It didn't make sense, but the voice was there, persistent and unnervingly familiar, as though it came from her own mind. "Just open it," it murmured, low and insidious. "See what's out there. You'll be safer if you open it." Emma shook her head violently, trying to drown out the whisper, but it was no use. Her fingers twitched against the lock, and for a horrifying moment she realized she was actually considering it. A fresh wave of panic washed over her, and she yanked her hand away as if the lock itself were burning hot. "No," she whispered aloud, her voice trembling. "I'm not opening it. I'm not—" Before she could finish, a deafening bang erupted from the roof of the car, followed by a deep, resonating creak. The metal above her head groaned as though something impossibly heavy was crawling across it. Emma froze, her body rigid, her breathing shallow. The air inside the car had grown impossibly thick, suffocating her with every inhale. She could hear the weight shifting above her, deliberate and slow, each movement accompanied by the sickening scrape of claws, or something worse, dragging against the metal. The roof began to dent inward, shallow at first, but then deeper, the shape of the intrusion forming an unnatural humanoid outline. Emma's gaze was locked on the ceiling, her chest rising and falling in shallow, panicked gasps. She wanted to run, to fling the door open and sprint into the darkness, but her body refused to move. She was trapped, paralyzed by a fear so profound that it felt like her mind had been unhinged. The whispers returned, louder now, overlapping voices speaking in a language that didn't belong to this world. The sounds twisted and distorted, rising and falling in pitch, scraping against her thoughts like nails on a chalkboard. Emma pressed her hands against her ears, but the voices didn't stop. They weren't coming from outside. They were inside her head, clawing at her sanity. She tried to focus, to drown them out, but her mind felt fractured, as though something else had invaded it and was sifting through her memories, her thoughts, her fears. And then everything went silent. The sudden stillness was more terrifying than the noise. The weight on the roof was gone. The whispers ceased. Even the distant pulsing light seemed to dim, retreating further into the void. Emma sat motionless, her body trembling uncontrollably. She dared to hope, just for a moment, that it was over, that whatever had been tormenting her had finally left. But deep down, she knew better. The quiet was not a reprieve. It was a warning. A new sound broke the silence. It was faint at first, a soft scratching noise like nails dragging against glass. It came from the passenger side window, steady and deliberate. Emma's head snapped toward the sound, her eyes widening in horror as she saw it. A long, spindly hand pressed against the glass. Its fingers were unnaturally thin, each one tipped with a razor-sharp claw that glinted faintly in the dim light. The hand moved slowly, almost lazily, as if it had all the time in the world. It wasn't trying to break the glass. It was taunting her. Emma's breath hitched as the hand withdrew, leaving behind faint streaks on the window. But before she could even process what she'd seen, the entire car shook violently. The frame groaned under the pressure, the windows rattling as though something enormous had grabbed the vehicle and was trying to lift it. Emma screamed, her hands clutching the steering wheel as if it would somehow anchor her. The car tilted slightly to one side, its tires screeching against the asphalt. The phone in her lap buzzed again, startling her so badly that she almost dropped it. She glanced down, her heart pounding. The screen displayed a single word in large, glitching text. "Look." She didn't want to. Every fiber of her being screamed at her to keep her eyes down, to avoid whatever was outside, but the compulsion was too strong. Slowly, as though being pulled by invisible strings, her head turned toward the windshield. The light was closer now, much closer. It wasn't just a glow anymore. It had form, substance. The edges of it pulsed and writhed like living tissue, expanding and contracting in ways that defied logic. And within the light, something moved. It wasn't a figure, not exactly. It was a shifting, amorphous shape that seemed to exist on the edge of perception, impossible to fully comprehend. Her eyes couldn't focus on it, sliding off its form as though her mind refused to process what it was seeing. And then it stepped forward. The shape solidified, taking on the form of a tall, impossibly thin figure. Its skin glistened like wet metal, reflecting the pulsing light in unsettling ways. Its head was elongated, its features sharp and angular, but its eyes, if they could even be called that, were the most horrifying part. They were deep, empty voids that seemed to draw her in, pulling at her thoughts, her memories, her very essence. The figure tilted its head, studying her with an intelligence that felt ancient and predatory. And then it smiled. Not with its mouth. Its entire face split open, jagged rows of teeth gleaming in the light. Emma's scream caught in her throat as the passenger door handle began to turn again, this time with a slow, deliberate precision. The passenger door handle turned slowly, deliberately, each metallic creak slicing through the suffocating silence like a blade. Emma's entire body locked in place, her mind a storm of panic and disbelief. She stared, unable to look away, as the handle twisted further downward. The motion was torturously slow, as if whoever or whatever was on the other side wanted her to absorb every excruciating second. Her pulse thundered in her ears, her breath coming in shallow, ragged gasps. She clutched the steering wheel so tightly that her fingers ached, but she couldn't bring herself to move, to act. A primal fear rooted her to the spot, an instinct that whispered it was already too late. And then the handle stopped. For a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. The silence was deafening, so complete that Emma could hear the faint sound of her own heartbeat hammering against her ribcage. Her mind raced with possibilities. Had it given up? Was it waiting for her to make the first move? Or was this just another cruel game, a prelude to something far worse? She swallowed hard, her throat dry and raw, and dared to hope that whatever was out there might simply leave. But then the door swung open. It didn't burst open violently. It didn't fly off its hinges or slam against the frame. No, the door eased open with a quiet, almost reverent grace, as if the unseen force behind it was savoring the moment. Cold air rushed into the car, carrying with it a stench so overwhelming that Emma gagged. It was a sickening combination of damp earth, decayed flesh, and something sharp and metallic like rusted iron. The smell clung to her skin, her hair, her clothes, sinking into her lungs with every breath. And then she saw it. The figure stepped into view, its impossibly tall frame folding itself into the small space between the open door and the passenger seat. It moved with an unnatural fluidity, its limbs bending in ways that defied logic, as though its joints were made of something other than bone. The glow from the distant light illuminated its form in fragments, casting jagged shadows that seemed to writhe and shift like living things. Its skin was a pallid, glistening gray, slick with a sheen that reflected the faint light like oil on water. The face, if it could even be called that, was a grotesque mockery of humanity. Its elongated skull tapered to a sharp point at the chin, and its eyes were nothing but hollow voids, blacker than the surrounding night. Yet Emma could feel its gaze, an oppressive weight that pressed against her mind, peeling back her thoughts layer by layer. It was searching her, probing her, dissecting her very essence. Her lips quivered as she tried to scream, but no sound came out. Her voice had abandoned her, stolen by the creature's mere presence. And then it smiled. The smile was a jagged tear that split its face from one side to the other, revealing rows of serrated teeth that glinted wetly in the dim light. The teeth were too numerous, too uneven, some sharp and others broken, as if they'd been used to chew through things far tougher than flesh. The smile wasn't meant to convey friendliness or malice. It was a statement, a horrifying declaration of dominance. The creature tilted its head, the motion slow and deliberate, as if mocking her. Then, with an almost casual ease, it reached into the car. Its spindly arms stretched impossibly far, the fingers on its hand extending like thin, barbed wires. Emma shrank back, pressing herself against the driver's side door, her breath hitching as the hand hovered mere inches from her face. She could feel the cold radiating from it, a bone-deep chill that seemed to leach the warmth from her very soul. "Stay away!" she finally managed to scream, her voice raw and broken. But the creature didn't flinch, didn't react. It merely continued to hover there, its head cocked as though studying her. And then, without warning, its fingers curled around her phone, still buzzing weakly in her lap. Emma watched, paralyzed, as the creature held the phone up to its face, or where its face should have been. The screen flickered, the image on it distorting into a mess of static and jagged lines. And then, in a voice that didn't belong to her, a voice that was both familiar and alien at the same time, the phone spoke. "You are not supposed to be here." The words sent a jolt of terror through Emma, more potent than anything she had ever felt. They weren't a threat, not exactly. They were a statement of fact, delivered with a chilling certainty that left no room for doubt. She wanted to scream again, to push the creature away, to run, but her body refused to move. The creature's smile widened, splitting its face even further, and it leaned closer, the voids of its eyes now mere inches from hers. Emma's vision blurred as tears streamed down her face, her mind fraying at the edges. She could feel it probing deeper, not just into her thoughts, but into her memories, her fears, her very identity. It was consuming her, piece by piece, unraveling her like a thread pulled from a tapestry. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, it stopped. The creature straightened, its grotesque smile fading into an expressionless void. It turned its head toward the pulsing light in the distance, which had grown brighter, larger, as if it were moving closer. Emma could barely think, her mind a haze of terror and confusion, but she could sense the change. The creature wasn't looking at her anymore. It was looking past her, at something far worse. The light flared, engulfing everything in its blinding radiance. Emma screamed, shielding her eyes, but the light pierced through her closed lids, burning into her skull. She felt herself being pulled, her body weightless, as if the car and everything around it had ceased to exist. When the light finally faded, Emma found herself sitting in her car again, parked on the side of the road. The engine was running, the radio softly playing a static-filled tune. The night was calm, the sky above filled with stars. She looked around, her heart still racing, but there was nothing out of place. No creature, no pulsing light. For a moment, she thought it had all been a hallucination, a nightmare brought on by exhaustion. But then she glanced at her phone. The screen was cracked, the faint glow of a single word displayed in jagged text. Soon. Emma's scream echoed into the empty night as the engine stalled and the stars above flickered and disappeared. If you enjoyed this chilling tale and want more stories that make you question what's lurking in the shadows, make sure to subscribe to the channel and hit the bell icon for notifications. And tell me, the next time you're driving down an empty highway, how will you know you're really alone?